One of the major challenges related to money in politics is the lack of transparency surrounding political party and election finance. Open and transparent funding of political parties and candidates is desirable because it helps to ensure everyone is playing by the rules. This in turn strengthens the integrity of and trust in politics of the general public and political parties in Africa. Transparency helps to level the playing field, exposes the risk of undue influence over politicians, and helps protect against the infiltration of illicit sources of money, thus contributing to the broader fight against corruption. In recent years, there has been considerable progress in the use of information technology to enhance transparency in financing political parties and election campaigns. The rapid digitalization of government agencies, political parties, and citizens alike has significantly expanded the potential to use digital tools to enhance transparency. Use of technology, including digital tools such as websites, programs, and online resources, can help provide solutions towards addressing undeclared, undisclosed, and/or dirty money in politics. When a country builds an online reporting and disclosure system, it becomes part of a wider societal effort to protect and enhance the integrity of politics. In this 8th webinar series on money in politics in Africa, we interrogate the role of ICT in political finance reporting and disclosure.
A very good afternoon and good evening, good morning, everywhere you're watching us from. Welcome to Money in Politics webinar series that takes place every month, the last Thursday of every month, brought to you by Alliance Finance, monitoring a political finance watchdog in Africa. Today we are going to be interrogating the role of ICT in enhancing transparent political finance in Africa. With me to navigate this theme are three international experts. Let me start with introducing Dr. Magnus Ohman, who is serving as the Senior Political Finance Advisor at the International Foundation for Electoral Systems, that is IFES. Dr. Ohman has extensive global experience in supporting political finance initiatives in more than 45 countries globally, and some of those countries are also in Africa. Some of them that are in Africa are Tunisia, we have Sudan, Zimbabwe, Kenya, Tanzania, among others. So he's going to bring a lot of experience in terms of whatever he has been doing. He's also currently serving as the director of the International Foundation for Electoral Systems. That's a regional Europe office. He brings in a lot of experiences in terms of the research he has done globally and also in Africa here in terms of in the field of political finance. Dr. Ohman, you're very welcome, and we are happy to have you today. And then also we are going to be joined by Miss Elena, who is she works with Zimbabwe network of elections. So she has over 20 years of experience working on electoral governance and democracy in Zimbabwe and beyond the borders. She has managed electoral projects on various aspects around the electoral cycle, including political party campaign finances. Over the years, she has observed and assessed elections in countries such as Bangladesh, Sudan, Tanzania, Malawi, South Africa, Zambia, Rwanda, Uganda, Namibia, Ghana, among others. So she's bringing a lot of experience also in terms of her area of expertise, where she has done a lot of work on election observation and also in the area of political financing. Ms. Ellen, you're welcome, and we are happy to have you today.
Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me.
And lastly, we are going to have Mr. Emmanuel Oluka, who is an ICT expert from Uganda. He has done a lot of work in terms of developing platforms that have been used in monitoring campaigns and also elections in Uganda. Recently, he was one in charge, spearheaded the one that they used on election day, and he has also done a lot of work across other countries in terms of helping them develop ICT technologies that are used in terms of election observation. So we know he's going to bring in a lot of expertise in terms of how ICT can be used in enhancing transparency in political financing in Africa. He's also currently the executive director of Citizen Watch Uganda, which is in charge of helping organizations in democracy in terms of developing platforms that can be used to monitor elections and other digital platforms. Mr. Emmanuel, you're welcome.
Thank you very much, Abel, and thank you for hosting me and for inviting me onto the platform. I'm very happy to join the rest of the other colleagues on the panel. Thank you.
Sorry, I'm saying I will start with Dr. Hoffman. You have researched and written extensively on the subject of political finance across the world. Why is transparency such an important thing in political finance, and why do you think Africa should embrace it?
Democracy means that we have politicians who want to govern our countries, and it is essential for the people in these countries to know how those who want to govern them, in other words, raise and spend their money, because that is essential for democracy to have a level playing field. But it is also essential for issues like corruption to know, am I giving contracts to people who have supported me and that they can use to win further benefits? It's essential for governance if decisions are based on thorough research, or if, again, public bids are given to the ones who supported the leaders with money. And it's generally important for the economy. If we have a lack of money, as we do, how we need to make sure that the money of the state are used in the most effective way. So it's essential to have this transparency. And I'd say that political finance, if anywhere on this planet that issue is important, particularly important, it is in the countries in Africa. Because we are looking at situations with huge amounts of spending, especially in relation to the economy as a whole. We're looking about often very limited transparency. There's often no information or very little information available about how politicians raise and spend money. Massive issues with the use of state resources in elections, vote buying, etc. So this is an issue that across Africa, even more than anywhere else in the world, needs to be embraced and discussed.
Thank you, Dr. Umar. I will now bring you Ms. Ellen Digan. You have observed elections across the African continent, and as we speak, you are in Kenya on a long-term observation mission under the auspices of the African Union. Can you bring us up to speed with the situation on the political finance transparency in Zimbabwe, your mother country, but also in other African countries you have observed?
Thank you very much. For me, the first thing I want to note is that when you're looking at political parties' finance, especially in Africa, expenditure and how funds are collected, the political parties funding itself in general, you find that the information that is available is quite inadequate. There isn't much. And even when you analyze the legal frameworks or the policies within political parties or the legal frameworks of most of the African countries, again, there is no adequate information or sound policies around political parties' finance. So, in as far as the ICTs, the adoption of ICTs, information technologies, they can actually play an imperative role in providing efficiency in the political arena in Africa to ensure transparent, open, and citizen participation, accountability, and effectiveness. In the sense that, I'll give an example of here where I am in Kenya. where we have noted that most of the political parties that are campaigning are using quite huge resources. And we have an opposition leader, Honorable Raila Odinga, being supported by an incumbent president. Then we have a deputy president of Kenya, who is currently in government, also using quite a number of resources. But what is not clear is which resources are they using, the source of the resources are they are using. It's not very clear. But when you now look at WhatsApp video, YouTube videos, because of now what social media can do, citizens just record some of these things and they post on this social media platform. You see them coming with helicopters to the rallies. I think at one of the rallies, one of the two candidates, I will not mention the names, of course, but one of the two front runners, at one of the rallies, they had 7 helicopters. So then you think, okay, 7 helicopters, the resources that are required to hire or to have a helicopter at a rally. But then after that, realizing that, I then try to interrogate the law, what is provided for in the law in terms of political parties funding. What I realized was that in Kenya, they actually were trying to put in place a political parties finance amendment, which was not passed by the last parliament, which has just adjourned for the election, which was, the law was supposed now to give a threshold for what political parties can use in terms of campaigning for any particular election. So without such kind of policy or a law, it becomes very difficult for any countries to really enforce any mechanisms of ensuring that there's a level playing field in terms of the use of resources in political parties campaigning and even political parties financing. Then I will draw back to my country, Zimbabwe. Again, we have the same challenge where we have only political parties that are in power, that are in parliament, sorry, are the ones that can only receive political parties finance. But again, there's no threshold in terms of what they can use. There's also no policies and mechanisms to monitor or safeguard. Then it brings us the issue of what we can do as citizen observers, as domestic observers, international observers, in terms of monitoring what kind of resources are at play when it comes to campaigning. And I want to bring in again the need for capacity, the need for ability by domestic observers, international observers, to actually quantify some of these resources that are being used during campaigning, and advocate for policies that ensures that there's a level playing field when it comes to campaigning. So we can, I can quickly think of things like having things like drones to monitor the numbers, or to monitor things like posters, t-shirts being distributed, whatever things that are distributed during political parties rallies, so that at least we can have some quantification of these resources and come up with numbers, figures, the actual figures of money that is being used in campaigning, and see the costs vis-a-vis what our policies are saying, and come up with sound policies that can provide a level playing field for emerging parties, small parties, and the parties that are already in power. So I think for now, I hand over back to you, Mr. Moderator. Thank you.
Thank you. I want now to go to Mr. Emmanuel Oluka. In Uganda, you're known as an ICT expert in elections, and you have done a lot of work in terms of helping develop various technology platforms that have been used in monitoring elections and all sorts of things. And we know that Uganda grapples with the challenge of opaque political finance, where nobody knows where the money that finances the election comes from. How, in your view, can ICT be used to provide solutions for political finance reporting and disclosure?
Abel, thank you very much for that question. Indeed, like you mentioned, I've been around elections probably for close to 15 years in Uganda. And mainly my interest has been to look at the role of technology as far as elections are concerned and what they can actually bring on table. And what is quite interesting and what is imperative from all the last couple of years in terms of experience has been the fact that, first of all, we need to look at the legal framework in the country. When you look at political finance campaign, the enabling law itself has been quite opaque. Just like our sister Ellen is saying, it's probably similar in similar context. So usually ICT comes into play an enabling role. I always say that technology is only 20% and the 80% is relationships, people, the legal framework, and the rest of the things. So technology indeed can go ahead and share sort of data that can enable us to identify how much political parties are actually spending on terms of elections. If the data sets are available, the clear resources of that money is available, maybe we could even be able to access some of this information on some of the websites for the different political parties. But you'll notice that a lot of this information is actually not available in those spaces. So unfortunately, we are left with the idea of looking at it from the output side other than the input side, just to quantify how much in terms of expenditure a political party is spending in terms of media, how much are spending in terms of maybe their transport and movement. Of course, in Uganda here, you can't even use helicopters apart from the president, who only has that benefit. I don't think there's any other politician who we have ever seen using a helicopter for campaigns. Of course, we can also look at how much they've done a lot of these huge billboards that we see being done during an electoral campaign and a season. So we can only be able to assess that information from what the expenditure looks like, and we try to quantify that in terms of figures, just to give us a sort of projection as to how much has been spent in these processes. But indeed, yes, technology is a very critical component in terms of enhancing transparency in these processes. But you also need to realize that even in Uganda as a country, much as technology is an enabler, we also have sort of policies sometimes that push back the use of technology itself. When, for instance, you look at things like access to social media, many a time we've seen social media shut down in Uganda during election seasons. We remember there was no internet for almost a whole week during the last year's presidential campaign. You remember before that, Facebook was shut down. In fact, up to now, Facebook is actually still shut down. So at the end of the day, much as technology does play a role, we also realize that government is still uncomfortable with the role and the potential it can actually deliver. I think the other thing which we noticed in the last campaigns is that other political parties that didn't have access to traditional media like TVs and so forth actually used a lot of technology to share their live feeds about what was happening, and it became a huge platform within which they were able to share out their information and sort of with the wider masses, with the youth movements and so forth. So I think even when we try to understand the role of technology, indeed, which is very important, we can also understand the mere fact that it has its own challenges legally, it has political will challenges, but indeed, like I would share with the rest of us here, technology is a critical component as far as democracy is concerned, not just in Uganda. I have done elections in Uganda, I've done in Somalia, in Kenya, in Tunisia, Ghana, on election observation with different platforms. And believe me, technology is a critical component of it all, even not beyond just the campaign financing itself, even with the electoral system, even with the EMBs themselves. Technology plays a critical role. I know for sure that my sister Ellen is aware about the team of technology experts who are providing the smart system for the IEBC, who were arrested, and there was a letter from the IEBC about it. So we all know that the role of technology is very critical as far as democracy and all the other processes of elections are concerned. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'll come back to Dr. Hoffman. You have done a lot of research extensively globally, and I want to know from you as an expert in this field of political finance, from where you stand, how can ICT be used to provide solutions for promoting transparency and accountability in financing political parties and election campaigns?
Well, thank you, Abel. And I'll talk about the advantages of ICT in monitoring campaign finance, bearing in mind that I completely agree with what Emmanuel was just talking about, the limitations, and I'll be happy to talk about that first. But Starting with the advantages, there are potentially very significant advantages of using ICT in monitoring campaign finance. One is the basic submission of financial information by parties and by candidates. The requirements are very low. I mean, it's enough to have a smartphone. If you put up the app and you have internet, you can use that to submit information. Compared to a decade ago, I was working with commissions dealing with this in different parts of Africa, and Sierra Leone in particular. It is significantly easier to do now. Then we have the issue of reviews of submitted financial data. And that's one that's often lost in this discussion, and I really, really want to emphasize that. The institution in charge of overseeing compliance with the regulations, which in Africa tends to be the election management body, can use data that they receive and cross-check and compare it with other data sources. For example, you can cross-check donation records with tax records. So you can see this person is claimed to have donated this amount, but this person actually only earned that amount last year. That doesn't seem to match. So that will raise a red flag of potential fake donation records. And again, I'll talk more about the shortcomings, the difficulties with this, but in theory, it is potentially very useful. And also then the third aspect of this, which is the publication of data. Most African election commissions and other bodies dealing with this do publish some information on the website, but it tends to be scanned PDFs of hard copy reports, often handwritten reports. It's almost impossible to read them in many cases. It is impossible to scrape the data and get the data into a computer system by electronic means. It has to be done by hand. And if you have an electronic publication, if you have a database, what I would like to do as a minimum is to go in and see, has Ellen or anyone else made a donation to any political party or any candidate in any election? If I can't do that, then the system is not good enough. It's actually not difficult to do, assuming, and I agree with Emmanuel again, that we have the right data available. And then there are so many different aspects of this. It can provide parallel tracks of information. So oversight bodies can have not only the information from parties, but also from banks, also from TV stations, etc., etc. This can also then be made available to the people. Where it works well, we now have real-time publication of donation records. So if you make a donation to a political party, that information becomes public immediately because the donation is made in the banking system. It does require that the donation is actually made through the banking system. We'll talk more about that. It can also help to identify things like abuse of state resources. We can track government budgets and see, are they spending more or budgeting more in relation to an election campaign? Are they spending more money in certain areas that we know are relevant? Services to citizens, health, infrastructure, and education tends to be the key areas. And it can be incredibly important for journalists and election observers to allow them to follow the money. So there is huge potential in ICT in bringing transparency in election and campaign finance. And then there are some difficulties as well, but I'll get to that in a second.
Thank you, Dr. Oman. I will go back to Miss Ellen Digane. I know you are right now in Kenya, and I want you to bring us up to speed on how IEBC, that's the National Election Management Body, is handling so far the issue of campaign finance disclosure. Are there any other lessons maybe we can learn from what Kenya is doing and that can be shared among other African countries, or it's just a basket case? Nothing is being done. Can you be able to share with us what's happening?
Okay, thank you very much. From what I know, I think I'll check again, but from what I know at the moment, I don't think there is much that they are doing. Like I indicated, there is no law that compels political parties to use a certain amount of money. And also there is, of course, the issue of use of public resources, abuse of public resources, what some say misuse of public resources. I think it's general, it's everywhere, that it should be not so. Public resources should not be used to benefit one political party in any context. But like I indicated earlier, the complexities around this election, where you have a incumbent president supporting opposition, and then a deputy president also running as a presidential candidate. So the complexities around the election makes it prone to abuse of state resources by both front runners. But I don't have evidence that that is what is happening. But I just gave an example of how also ICTs helped us as observers to see that there's a potential abuse of state resources by virtue of having a candidate coming to a rally with 7 helicopters, an entourage of 7 helicopters. So we don't know where the resources are from, whether that was funded by a private person or from party finances. The information is not there, but I was just trying to link the way social media is also at play in terms of helping us as political analysts to see some of the things that we may not see when we are observing elections. In the case, that rally was outside Nairobi, and I'm in Nairobi, so there's no way I would have known about that had it not been for the social media platform. So that's how I was bringing in now the ICTs in that angle. Then I want to agree to what Magnus has alluded to. You asked also a question that have we ever funded political parties ourselves? I don't know whether you're asking me as an individual or my organization. As an individual, no. And as an organization, no as well. We have never done that as an organization. But I want to bring to the discussion an example of that happened in my country. I think it was sometime, I think 3 or so months ago, just before our by-elections that were held in March, where there was a lot of violence targeted at the main opposition leader. I think those who follow Zimbabwe politics, the opposition leader is Nelson Chamisa. So there was a lot of violence targeted at this party, and citizens, Zimbabweans and others in the diaspora managed to crowdsource through the use of a social media handle to raise funds for purchasing a vehicle which is bulletproof for the party leader. So they tried to mobilize resources to purchase a vehicle that is bulletproof. So following the discussion, at some point, there were issues around that. When the money was raised, I think about $250,000 at some point. Then there were issues of accountability that were raised by some of the members. So they were having this Twitter space discussing, and some of the Twitter spaces, they were arguing about the absence of transparency in terms of how the money was being handled within the party. So issues of also intra-party transparency, and these people who were donating, probably they were not even party supporters, maybe other external people. Then I also want to discuss the issue of openness. I think, Magnus, in a normal democracy, in maybe in Western countries, it's very, very possible, what you were saying, that you have information from the banks, information about who is donating to who. But in our context, in particular my country, Zimbabwe, that is not possible. That information, you can never find that information. The banks, they don't disclose that. There's no disclosure of some of those things that you're talking about that are possible in other countries. And even now, journalists, just to be allowed to follow, even to get some of the information, general information, not even about money, about anything, it's not easy. My first profession is journalism, and I tell you, getting information in Zimbabwe from these key policymakers, stakeholders, it's very, very tough. So what more now issues about money? And also given the polarization in our societies, where if you're an opposition member or if you're in opposition politics, you are an enemy of the state. I think Uganda, you may relate to that. If you're opposition, you're an enemy to the state. So people who even fund or who even donate to opposition politics or political parties and who support opposition candidates or parties, they don't want to disclose. They don't want to be known. You know, they want to do it discreetly. They don't want to be known, because once they are known, even when they're in business, they start facing problems and challenges in that particular business. So it's very difficult even to have even those who are donating, even allowing you to disclose that they are donating money and they are funding you. So it comes with a whole lot of challenges in Africa, where of course it would be very ideal to track, even for us domestic observers. So in my country, I work for the Zimbabwe Election Support Network, the biggest observer group in Zimbabwe, citizen observers. We tried so many times to track political parties' financing, doing it manually, attending rallies, trying to see, okay, average, how many posters have been pasted in this area? How much does the PA system cost? How much does this cost? So that we just have an idea of how much political parties were using in terms of money. It's difficult. It's not easy. Some of the venues, if it's the ruling party, sometimes they are provided for free. Sometimes they don't pay. So it's very, very difficult. But I like the idea that the coming of ICTs may help, but only in instances where our democracy is also improving and there's openness and there's a fair competition between parties, not for political parties that are in opposition to be identified as enemies. Once we still have that scenario of opposition parties being labeled as enemies, it's very, very difficult. Then there's another issue also that comes in with ICTs. We have so many models, or so many systems that are coming to assist us in Africa to improve the way we monitor, to improve the way we track some of these things. What I've also realized is that sometimes it also increases the expense of our elections in Africa. I want to come back to Kenya. I think this time around, I don't have the evidence and data, but I think this time, just seeing what I'm seeing in Kenya and observing, I think this is one of the most expensive elections in Africa. The way they are using technology and the way they are also employing technology in trying to improve from what were some of the challenges in the last election with regards to technology. So it also makes our elections very, very expensive as well, in terms of tracking some things. And yet sometimes you don't get the information that you require. You want to do advance, try something else. I think earlier on I spoke about possibility of having drones, a drone that is moving around and you see what kind of materials, resources that are being used in a particular rally, and you download the information, then you try to analyze it. That also comes in with expense. So it also makes it very expensive. So probably let's also try to see technology in the sense of technology that is affordable, that we can utilize as Africans, that does not make our elections or our electoral processes, and even as observers, too expensive, so that at the end of the day, we may even fail to monitor or to build even capacities of people to observe and monitor some of these things. So for now, I will hand over back to you, moderator. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I want now to bring in Mr. Emmanuel Luka. Africa is home to the youngest population in the world, and young people have synonymous with gadgets like ICT apps. How can Africa harness the potential of young people in providing digital solutions to opaque financing of political parties and elections?
Yeah, thank you, Abel. That's a very interesting question. Indeed, just before I answer that, just to highlight something that Ellen just mentioned. In Uganda, what is also very interesting is that we have actually what we call the Financial Intelligence Authority, that basically monitors the money that comes in from abroad to any account, especially for political personnel who are known maybe in government. So most of those accounts are actually highly monitored with the FIA, and I think government has data about how that information is coming in, or even information coming in about money is coming into accounts of political parties. But indeed, for for citizens in the country, probably businessmen, they may be very discreet if they are giving money to political parties and probably just hand over cash, and it will be quite impossible from a technological perspective for you to gather that kind of information because of the discretion that is definitely involved. Now, back to your question that you asked, how can the young population in Africa harness the role of technology to try to address this issue around the opaqueness involved in political campaign financing? Yeah, indeed. I'm not sure. Do you guys hear me? Dr. Magnus is saying there's a problem with my speakers. Is that okay? Yeah, okay, that's fine. Yes. So indeed, the young people in Uganda, if you see the movement of the young people, especially on social media and on all these different platforms, be it Facebook, be it TikTok, be it Instagram, they share all these videos and things that are happening in different political campaigns. And indeed, it becomes a data source that we can actually harness as a source of data that we can use to verify how much money has been spent. However, there has to also be a caution. Much as technology itself is a good platform that we use, you also have to realize that it can also be used to actually share fake information. So as an observer, you're caught between identifying that what is shared online, is it genuine or is it not fake? So before you actually start to use it as your source of data, you want to be able to disaggregate that data to actually tell whether it actually makes sense or it's just fake data. Because if it's fake data, and then at the end of the day you use it within your report, then there are credibility issues eventually that end up coming to your platform. Indeed, technology plays that role. Globally, you remember the incident about the Trump campaign and this company that was based in the UK that eventually had to close down. Because, I mean, technology tools like AI, artificial intelligence, can actually be used for predictive analysis. And in a way, they can also be used in the ways that you share the data around political campaigns to share a certain narrative or political information. But indeed, the tools are available, and the young people are always very much interested in the use of these technology tools. I mean, today, the other advantage is that phones have become way more cheaper in Africa with Android. So for just $30, $20, they can easily afford the phones. Data is also becoming affordable for the youth. There are cheaper platforms that they can actually buy data and they can be able to share this information. It's a platform for learning. It's a platform for entertainment. So in a way, yes, it plays a critical component. But I think to empower them to do that, there has to be specific tailored training on how to empower the youth to be able to generate data that we can actually be used for research, so that even as we share research coming in from all this information regarding a political campaign, it is data that is based on a structured format of training that we can actually use to inform policy, to inform the legal framework, to inform all the other aspects that include elections, and to enhance transparency within the whole spectrum of the electoral processes. So even as we do that, there has to be specific, let's say maybe CSO organizations that need to play that role to just be able to collect the data, but also having a discussion with political parties themselves that, hey, can you start to adopt technology in terms of sharing your databases about how you receive data on at least the information as far as campaigns or donations that they receive that is genuine. Of course, in Uganda here, we have this money that political parties receive from government based on the numbers in parliament. At least you can be able to look at that. But there is still a lot of money that is used within elections that you can't quantify. You can't tell its source and so forth. And of course, it raises other challenges about the sources of this money when you're trying to combat issues like terrorism, when you want to combat money laundering and things like that. Of course, in Uganda, we have the Anti-Money Laundering Act, we have the Anti-Terrorism Act. So all these other issues are things that we need to pay attention to, even as we continue to conduct issues and pay attention to issues around political campaigns using technology or other manual and traditional methods. Thank you very much, Abel.
Thank you. I'll go now back to Dr. Magda. You have done a lot in this area, and I want to know whether African election management bodies and also governments are really ready to embrace ICT as a solution to the opaque political finance?
If African governments are ready to do this, no. But that's part of a larger issue, which is governments in African countries are not willing to address the issue of money in politics and transparency in that field in general. That's not related to ICT as such. So we need to remember that what we are talking about today is an issue where politicians regulate how politicians act, right? That's how a democracy works. We can't get away from that. But we must also realize the shortcomings and the negative consequences of that. And it means that to see change, we need to push from below. We need to push in terms of the demand side of saying we require transparency. If people are willing to make large donations, but they don't want the parties to tell anyone where the money came from, we need to push and say there should be a system in place where the politicians say, well, unfortunately, we can't receive that money if we are not able to tell people where it came from. Because otherwise there will be a big gap in our accounting and we'll be sanctioned by whatever institution is in charge. That is not the situation in any African country today, but it's where we're aiming for. That's where we need to go. So there needs to be a demand from below to say, you, the governments of our country, need to make sure that we bring in transparency in how politicians, parties, and election campaigns raise and spend money. And ICT is part of that with all the shortcomings that we were talking about.
I've read some reports across the globe. I still want you, Omar, to help us on that. There are various countries that are already complaining about the Bitcoin, where people are making donations using Bitcoin, and you cannot trace who is this person. And there are countries already are saying we need to stop donations that are coming through Bitcoin. And we know Bitcoin is one of now the technologies people can use to send money and do what. So what can you say about that?
Well, the jury is still very much out in relation to cryptocurrencies, including Bitcoin and others, in relation to campaign finance. There are a lot of complaints regarding the possibilities to achieve transparency. Then others are making the claim that it's actually, once you go into the system, more transparent than others. So there's still a lot of discussion to be had regarding the pros and cons. There is an argument, as you mentioned, to simply ban donations in cryptocurrency. That's a possibility, at least outside of countries, including some in Latin America, where cryptocurrencies have actually been accepted as a national currency.
I want to go back to Ellen. Ellen, there's a question coming out that has just been flashed on the screen from Henry, who is asking that who is that candidate who came, who is the presidential candidate that arrived at the campaign rally with 7 helicopters? I know you said you didn't want to mention it. Now one of our followers is trying to ask for who is the candidate. So I don't know whether you are comfortable disclosing who the candidate is before we can proceed.
No, I can't, because here I am with another organization in Kenya. I'm not with my organization that I work for, Zesin, but right now I'm speaking on behalf of Zesin, so I can't. But you can go on on social media, YouTube, just check the front runners. You'll see the videos. They are there. So I need to put that disclaimer as well. My reviews and what I'm talking about in this meeting are not for the organization that invited me in Kenya, which is African Union, but the organization that I work for. So yeah, so that one I'm not able to answer, unfortunately. My apologies. So do you have another question for me?
Yes, you initially hinted about how the Kenyan Parliament never accepted the Election Finance Act, which was brought to them by the IECB. They decided to kick it out, and now there's nothing that is regulating how politicians and candidates spend their money during this election. According to your own observation, as one of the observers for African Union, how has this affected maybe or the playing field in terms of spending, what money is coming, where money is coming from, and is Kenya having any plan of maybe coming up with any ICT solution in terms of stopping how much money comes in and knowing where is it coming from?
Okay, thanks. Again, I will repeat, I will not be able to speak on behalf of African Union. But like I indicated, it's an observation that I made personally, that the law for thresholds for giving parties a threshold in terms of what they can spend during campaigning was not passed by Parliament. I think Magnus said it very well, that policies are made by politicians, and those politicians are the same ones that contest in elections. So sometimes you find that they will not make policies that affects them as individuals or even as political parties. If there was going to be a threshold, it was going to disadvantage both the incumbent and also the opposition political parties. But somehow, of course, it will favor those small parties that do not have many resources. What I've also noted in some countries, what governments do, sometimes they actually give deals. They can give big deals for companies like maybe the Chinese to construct roads, give them big deals of billions of dollars or millions. And then as part of the deal, probably negotiated outside the contract that you need to fund us for the elections as a party or as a party in government. And I still want to come back to the issue of social media as ICTs. I think we've managed to get some of this information of such deals and such happenings in the social media arena, where we have people even within the government, disgruntled people, leaking this information out to the general public. So the role of an ordinary citizen now, I think, or in the role of citizen observers, but in particular, even citizens that are working in government institutions, in terms of releasing that information in the public domain, I think remains critical. What some may call maybe crowdsourcing, where a person has got a general public has information, they provide it to the different key stakeholders who can analyze and use that information in their advocacy, or use that information to influence change of policy in terms of whatever issues that are at play. So it's very important, I think, for stakeholders, in particular those who are engaged in this arena or this expertise. I think the likes of Magnus there, to help citizens, to help us as civic society to build our capacity, to also encourage citizens to provide us with this information so that we can use it and analyze it to influence policies. I will come back to the issue of helicopters that I alluded to. I was not at that particular rally, but I saw a video on YouTube and I was like, oh, wow, this person is quite rich. If it's state resources, then this should be interrogated. If it's personal resources, then that is very interesting. If it's a donation, so I was left with many questions, because it's massive money to have 7 helicopters at a rally. It's not a joke. So it helped us in terms of understanding the political arena better as observers. But like I said, I will not be able to draw much into that because I'm here standing in for another organization, but I'm invited here by African Union, so I cannot speak on behalf of African Union. But I just wanted to bring you to understand that let's also explore ICTs beyond what ICTs can do to analyze information, to help us get information, to help us improve transparency, but also how ICTs in terms of social media is being used to gather information that we can use as experts, as stakeholders, to analyze and influence policy, analyze and influence laws and regulations that improves and that gives a level playing field for all political parties. Imagine someone bringing 4x4 cars, Range Rovers, helicopters, yet an opposition emerging political parties. In the case of Kenya, there are 4 presidential candidates. The 2 front runners, I think these are the ones that are being talked about mostly. The 2 front runners, the current deputy president and the opposition political leader who is contested now. I think this is the 5th or 6th time, Honorable Raila Odinga. But the other two, if you compare the resources that they are using and these two, it's definitely not giving a level playing field for the 4 players. So we want to interrogate all those things with evidence. So this evidence is being provided for by citizens through social media platforms. So let's not ignore that kind of the role of ICTs, how ICTs are also playing part in such instances where we have citizens giving information through social media, and we are able now to see and analyze that as political analysts in some of this work that we do. And I also wanted to just respond briefly about what Magnus said, that governments need to be more transparent. I think as Africa, as African governments, we that's our wish. And that's where we also endeavor that our governments can do in terms of increasing transparency. But also remember that these governments, they don't want to be removed from power. So they will do whatever means to protect that power. They will do whatever they can to make sure that they are not removed from power. So this can be by making sure that they don't disclose any information that will jeopardize that will jeopardize whatever they can to retain power. So it's also quite very difficult even for citizen observers to really engage the government, to push the government to be transparent, or to push the government to adopt some of these policies and rules and laws that we are talking about, where we are saying government should be able to put in place laws. Of course, like for in line with what Uganda has, the financial intelligence, we also have that in my country. We also have issues of money laundering, but you find that they are only maybe applied, the rules and laws are only enforced to one side, the opposition political parties, civic society, and the government is not compelled to really not receive big donations or whatever from anyone inside or outside the country. So that's quite of that challenge is still there in Africa. If I can say, it's still there, it's still very alive, and we need also to continuously see how we can engage with our government to enhance transparency, which is not easy. As long as we are pushing for something that will expose them, it will not be easy for us. Yeah, thank you. Back to you, moderator.
Thank you. I want to know, I don't know whether Emmanuel is still with us. I wanted to ask him, as an expert in ICT, there are various issues that were always brought out by members and some of the politicians and also voters. They say even if we are to use ICT to ensure that there's transparency in financing of political parties, there's a likelihood that some of these ICT platforms can still be manipulated and hacked, and you see that the figures that are entered there can easily be hacked and changed by some who are not wishing well for that ICT platform or software which has been introduced to ensure that there's transparency. They can easily hack it and manipulate some of those figures. So I wanted him, as an expert in this area of ICT, how can African countries and also the world ensure that they can secure some of these platforms from hackers and those people who are having intentions of maybe sabotaging and manipulating the transparency of political financing of any country? I don't know whether, I think it's off. I've been told it's off, but I think Magnus can help us.
The thing, though, is that systems like this can be vulnerable to hacking, to interference, but that only really matters if the information is in these systems in the first place. And I think that's the challenge we're facing in most African countries today. I think Emmanuel said in the beginning, he said 80%, 20% ICT and 80% other work. And I think that's, well, we can discuss the figures, but that's a very relevant point to make. There are limitations to what ICT can do. And part of that is hacking. But beyond that, before that, I should say, it's what goes into the system itself. ICT tools cannot create transparency. If the data isn't there, there's nothing ICT can do to make it available to us. So in an ideal scenario, we would have citizens in Uganda, in Zimbabwe, in Ghana, in Kenya, in Lesotho, wherever you are, getting the data published by an oversight institution and say, is that right? Okay, I actually saw those 7 helicopters that we are now talking about. I haven't seen them either, so I don't know. But it's not in the financial report. So I'm going to report that there's a mistake there. That's an excellent thing because we can then use the people to assist in oversight. But it doesn't work if those financial data isn't submitted in the first place. If there is no data available to us, then they can't do it. ICT tools can't create data. I talked in the beginning about how we can cross-check donation records with tax records, for example. That can be an incredibly useful tool in saying, is what is being submitted reasonable? But only if there are donor records, and only if there are tax records, and they are good enough to be for us to be able to make those comparisons. The same thing with monitoring how state resources are used. That's only possible if the data is there. So I think a lot of what Ellen has been saying about the challenges that we're facing in African societies is incredibly relevant. And we haven't even started talking about vote buying, which of course tends to be almost entirely outside of the official system that ICT can help us with.
Thank you, Dr. Magnus Umman. I want to go back to Emmanuel. I wanted to ask you, but you had gone off. Good, you're back. ICT tools are very vulnerable to things like hacking, and they can easily be interfered with by either the state or other people who are not wishing good for anything coming out of ICT. So I wanted to know from you as an expert, do you think once African countries embrace the role of enhancing transparent political financing in Africa using ICT, how can they ensure that the vulnerability of being hacked and interfered is minimized or reduced from your perspective as an expert?
Thank you very much, Abel. Indeed, any technology platform all over the world is prone to being hacked. These systems are built by people. It's people who build them, and equally people can actually penetrate them. It doesn't mean that once you have a system built, it's not prone to vulnerabilities. As with the growth of technology, every system must continuously update itself. That's why you've noticed that globally, from a technological perspective, there are people who are called ethical hackers. They basically pay to try to penetrate systems, and from their experience, they are able to identify vulnerabilities of each system, and then they can be able to build improvement to ensure that they are safe. So as far as technology is concerned, every system definitely must adhere to standards about safety, and they have to continuously monitor and ensure that they build mechanisms within them to ensure safety. You've heard even of banks, even bank systems themselves. We've heard of fraudulent scenarios in the country itself here, where so many banks have lost a lot of money because of fraud. So every technology system all over the world may have vulnerabilities here and there. So it also means any system that you use that is built by people, because they're built by people, can be hacked. So it just means that you continuously have to improve your methods, you have to improve your system, you have to continue doing your checks. There has to be dedicated expertise to understand the best processes and build mechanisms for improvement and safety. So as far as that is concerned, I think it's just one of the things you have to be aware of when you're using any technology system, be it your email, be it your social media account, be it when you're accessing your bank records from a different country. I mean, all these things have to be conscious. When passwords, accounts, you've had people lose a lot of money on their account, on their bank systems. You've had election systems being hacked. You know, it was actually one of the key issues where the Supreme Court actually did.
I think we have lost Emmanuel. The network is, I think, disturbing him. But I wanted to come to Ms. Ellen Lingani. I know you are still in Kenya, and there are issues that are coming out of that election, which I don't know whether you'll be in position to share with us, or you're still reserved but you can share as an independent person, not as someone who is working with African Union. We have seen a lot of course, money. There are certain things that are happening, and everyone is asking him or her questions. Where is all this money coming from? Is it from the state? Because you find that now Raila Odinga is alongside Uhuru, but also you find that you find the other candidates also part who was a deputy president. So there is a mix of where people are still claiming most of the money is coming from the state, but they don't know how is it being channeled. Do they just use other means of using other deals to get it? So it's not clear on how the money is being gotten. So I wanted you to help us explain what is really happening there and how transparent is it in terms of accessing this money, our information about where these people are getting their money from. Do you have any access with information of such regard, or it's very difficult for you to get such information?
Yeah, to be honest with you, it's very difficult. I don't have that information. I don't know. We are only making assumptions because of the paradox around this election, where like I said, the president supporting the opposition, and also the other front runner being in government currently as deputy president. So I don't want to be honest with you. I don't have that information in terms of how the two are being funded as the two front runners. But from their campaigns, you can tell, you can derive a lot in terms of just judging that there is use of quite some significant resources are being used in this election in terms of these campaigns. But the actual source, to be honest with you, I wouldn't know. Then I saw there was a question that was posted by, I think it was Henry, if I'm not mistaken. It appeared on the screen. Okay, EMBs are the best. Okay. Yeah, I think to some extent, yes, EMBs can play a role in that, in promoting political parties, financing transparency, but it depends also with the models that each country may decide to adopt. I will give an example. For example, in my country, we don't have political parties financing regulation law. We only have the political parties financing law, but we don't have any political parties regulation law. Unlike other countries like Kenya, Tanzania, Rwanda, South Africa, they actually regulate and register political parties. So it's easier if a country has regulation or registration and regulation rather. It's easier for a country then to compel political parties to provide and to disclose their sources of funding. Also to provide whoever is regulating the political parties with audited accounts, annual reports, and all those kind of requirements, and to subject their finances under scrutiny by the body that is registering and regulating political parties. So in the case of Kenya, they have what they call the Office of the Registrar of Political Parties. All political parties are required to be registered under that institution. And then the EMB is also plays a role to some extent in terms of regulating political parties. I'll give an example of what they have here. They've got what they call the 2/3 rule, the 2/3 gender rule, which is provided for in the Constitution. But unfortunately, there's no enabling act to implement that particular gender rule. The EMB tried to compel political parties in this election to adhere to that particular provision in the Constitution. So that's also part of also regulating, compelling political parties to act in a way that is provided for in the law. Then we have countries like my country, Zimbabwe, where we don't have regulation, where we don't have political parties registration. I can just wake up today, me, my children, my family, we register our party. We don't even register. We just write a letter to the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission and notify them that we have a party called Party ABC. We are residing at this is where our offices are. These are our email addresses and telephone numbers if you want to contact us. That's all you do in Zimbabwe. So it then becomes very difficult for any institution, in particular the Electoral Commission, to regulate my finances as a party or to regulate my operations as a party. It's not, because there's no law that compels the management body to do that. But in some, so why I want to talk about models. So in some countries, they have a separate office of the registrar for political parties doing all that. Then in some countries, like South Africa, it's actually done by the Independent Electoral Commission of South Africa, which regulates, which register and so forth. So it depends with what model a country adopts and what model a country prefers. In my country, we are currently discussing the issues of regulation, and its advantages, I think, are more than the disadvantages. And I think it will also increase issues of transparency, and even issues of political parties finance are one of the things that we are saying. If there is regulation, if political parties formalize and register their parties, it's easier for a country to really scrutinize the operations of political parties, especially around political parties financing and how resources are being used. Even for those parties that are benefiting from the political parties funding now, it will also be easier to see how the monies are being used by a party, and even to compel political parties to use a certain percentage purely for administrations of the political party, and also to target allocation of some of the funding towards special interest groups like women, youth, people with disabilities within political parties. And I think it will also remove quite a number of allegations that we normally hear of, that money is being misused, abused, the money that is provided for by the government to political parties that are in parliament in the case of Zimbabwe. So EMB can do that. I think it's possible. South Africa is one of the countries that is doing that, but each country can choose what model they want, whether a separate office of the registrar of political parties that can regulate and register, or you just have your own office of the registrar that only registers and the EMB regulates, or you can have all in one residing in the election management body. So it depends with what model a country chooses. Thank you. Over.
Thank you. I want to bring now Dr. Magnus. You have done, I want to hear your insights on which model works best. Should it be the EMB, or there should be a creation of an independent political finance regulator that is in charge of ensuring that political parties report, disclose their finances, other than, again, having the electoral management body, which is in charge of conducting the elections and all other things, again, also trying to oversee how our political parties are funding, getting their resources and also funding their campaigns. What model is best for any country, or according to your own opinion?
So across Africa, it's mainly the election management body, the election commission, that deals with this issue, theoretically. Ellen highlighted the Kenya, we have the Office of the Registrar of Political Parties. We have similar institutions in a couple of countries. Also mentioned Madagascar has a different system. Sierra Leone has a separate commission for the registration of political parties, which is separate from the election commission, although the head of the election commission is a commissioner. There are advantages with having election management bodies as oversight institutions. They are fully aware of the political system. They are often very good at ICT compared to other institutions, so that can be an advantage in the context that we're talking about. There are also sensitivities, though. An election management body runs elections, right? And a key part of that means being seen as neutral, not being involved in politics. They are running the elections, and then whoever wins the elections wins the elections. It's a purely technical process. And as part of that, many EMBs, not least in Africa, really stress the point of not being involved in the political process. And I have a lot of sympathy for that. We can't get away from the fact that dealing with political finance is inherently political. So once you deal with this issue, you can't get away from the fact that there will be some certain sensitivities. If you sanction a political party, give them a fine, or they're not allowed to run in elections, or they lose public funding, etc., those sanctions have political consequences. So I can see that there are also disadvantages, and many election management bodies in African countries don't really want to have this mandate. It may be worth stressing, no institution wants to have this mandate. It's not particularly popular with anyone, which I can understand. There is a lot of debate on the best model for this. There is no consensus. I think we should stress that. I think a key point of what Ellen said of an advantage with EMBs is, well, they are there and they can do the job. What I think we should warn against is creating a new commission or a new entity that will deal with this specifically. That's not necessarily solving any problems. A key point is that regardless of what model, regardless of what institution that is in charge, more important is that it has certain factors. It needs to have the independence to run effective oversight of party and campaign finance. In theory, election management bodies across Africa have this. In practice, it may be worse. So this is different in like North Africa, for example, when a number of countries it's a ministry, often the Minister of the Interior, that runs elections. That's problematic because they don't necessarily have that independence. The body must have the mandate and the powers to act in relation to these issues so that they can actually take on powerful political actors. They must have the resources to do this. The Independent National Electoral Commission in Nigeria has worked on bringing transparency in Nigerian elections. There are a lot of people in Nigeria. They don't necessarily have the resources that are needed. And the final, but I'd say the most important, is regardless of the model, the institution put in charge must have the political will so that they can take on the government party, main opposition parties, big politicians, and say, you know what, you're not actually following the rules, so we're going to initiate sanctions against you.
Thank you. There was a question, Elizabeth, I saw Lisa Karungi had asked, I think it was going to Dr. Magnus. How are European electoral jurisdictions using information and communication technology to enhance transparency? And I would like, while you're responding to that, also you connect to what can Africa borrow from, how maybe the European jurisdictions are using ICT to enhance transparency in political financing.
So it does vary quite a lot across Europe. And I would say that leading this process right now is Eastern and Southeastern Europe. The former communist countries come out of dictatorships. They are very good at, especially the publication side, to make data available to citizens. There are still ways to go, but they're really good at that. We have in a number of European countries electronic reporting, so that parties submit their reports directly electronically. There's no paper format. And there are in some countries, like Finland, for example, parties submit their financial reports, and when they do that, they become available to the public automatically. So the oversight institution, which happens to be an audit body here, they don't actually do anything. They just sit there, they provide the platform, the parties upload the data, and it becomes available to the public. What's mainly lacking in many European countries is the tools for using this data to control its accuracy. And that's not really that the ICT isn't there. It's not that it's not being used to cross-check these financial records with other data that's available, tax records, custom records, on all host of things. There's a lot that Africa can learn from the European experience, good things, and also a lot of bad things that European countries have done over the years, things that they have, mistakes that they have learned from. But it then boils down to, we need to have this data available to us. If, as Ellen was talking about, we don't have this information about donations submitted to us, then there's nothing we can do with ICT to make it available. So that needs to be the starting point.
Thank you, Dr. Magnus. I want now to bring Mr. Emmanuel. I know you've this moved around some of the African countries, and want you to share with us some of the experiences you got from there in terms of how those countries are using ICT, in terms of, have they embraced ICT in terms of enhancing transparent political financing, and they, maybe if they have not, there are some discussions that some of them are having in order to embrace ICT.
Thank you, moderator. That's an interesting question. My personal observation in terms of the use of ICT across most African countries is that we're pretty much almost at the same level. The difference is really very small. I mean, the difference is just based on access. How many people actually do have access to internet? How many people have access to tools? How many people actually know, in terms of literacy levels, how to use these technology systems here and there. So across the experience we have in Uganda is pretty much close to the experience in Kenya, the experience in Zimbabwe, in West Africa, in Nigeria, or even in Liberia for that matter. So many of the African countries are pretty much at the same or close level in terms of how they have embraced technology. The difference is actually really small, apart from penetration, access, the costs, illiteracy. That's where you see a couple of differences. So what you'd notice is that I think, first of all, technology is still very young within the African context and even globally. And I think many of the democracies in Africa are still young. They're still learning from these mistakes. Many of the democracies are adopting how to embrace technology. It also means the same political parties as well are adopting how to use technology. Perhaps you'll probably notice that many of the political parties are trying to use maybe ICT to register their members, in terms of knowing how many members do we actually have. Maybe you have a sort of database that you can use so that you can be able to sort of reach out to them whenever you're having a campaign or an election, registration of their own political party databases and so forth. Of course, that's where you notice. And of course, there are resources that are required to do that. But you don't think there is anything complicated about their registration databases. Most of them are probably just running on basic Excel. It's really very rare for you to find a political party that has actually adopted, maybe they're having a system and a database that can actually be able to provide infographics about the distribution of their registered voters across the different geopolitical areas, regions or locations. So at the end of the day, aggregation of this data is also quite something that is lacking. And like I want to agree with Dr. Magnus, the thing about technology is that it can't create its own data. There has to be willingness to provide the data, and that data needs to be structured and not just, sitting there. If you look at most of the political parties, or even most websites in Africa, they're rarely updated. You don't have updated information and content on what you can actually use. So the challenges do exist, and yet we also recognize the potential that technology can bring. And I think maybe continuously, as we continue to engage with technology, there's room for improvements, there's room to learn, there's room to make mistakes, there's room to improve on those mistakes, there's room to learn from those who have done a better maybe analysis. And I mean, when you look at, for instance, the political parties, look at Kenya, where Ellen is right now. Every time there is a presidential election, it feels like there's a new political party that comes to play within the field. So every time there are always collaborations. There's just no one traditional party. When you look at the traditional parties like KANU and so forth, they pretty much have been phased out. So every time there's a new election, it means every sort of presidential leader of a different political party comes together and, brings these numbers to the table. So you'll see Azimio has its own coalition, the Kwanza party has its own coalition. So even capturing that kind of data, it's quite difficult actually for Kenya, for them to actually tell exactly what numbers they even have as each of these coalitions, because they just got married recently last year, and now they're running a campaign. Everybody's talking about the numbers they have. I think the only thing that is in Kenya is just to represent the registered voters as per the regions. So you'll know the biggest majority of voters is maybe the mountain votes, then maybe parts of Kisumu and so forth. So the best they can do is look at the data that is available from Electoral Commission as far as the number of registered voters is concerned, and probably adopt that to inform their sort of context of campaigns and so forth. But also look at our own national registry of databases in Uganda. I mean, during the last elections, all we had to do was to adopt the data that was captured with NIRA, with the National Information Registration Authority, and it actually became an informed the national database for registered voters for the Electoral Commission. You see, I think recently in Nigeria as well, they've just introduced, I was seeing INEC doing registration now for national IDs for citizens, and there's been a huge push for them to actually call on citizens using the national IDs, the NIN numbers, to now register to vote. And I think that's a current campaign that is running on in Nigeria. So when you look at most of the African countries, at least we are fortunate in Uganda that by the time we're doing the national registration, we actually adopted quite a lot of technology in terms of capturing biodata for that particular database. So you remember when you're registering for national IDs, you capture all the biodata, the facial input, the fingerprint input, and all this data that has actually been shared with the election management body, Electoral Commission. I think that's a huge plus, because that's clean, credible data that can be used and can also be shared across other government agencies for whatever resources. Now, when you need a passport, they actually use your national identification database to actually generate you a passport. It's the same information. So we've seen technology goes ahead to play a particularly very important role when these processes are going on. But we also recognize the challenges that most African countries, most political parties go on as far as adopting technology and so forth. And I think it's still at its basic level. We're still growing. We still need to learn how to capture this data, how to keep it clean, how to use it, how to improve it, how to secure it, and how do we use that data to actually inform the different engagements that we do across most African democracies. Thank you.
Thank you, Emmanuel. We now go to Ms. Ellen, who wants to explain herself shortly. Dr. Ohman shared about that technology cannot provide its own data. And we know that in most African countries, most politicians and political parties don't like disclosing any data they have. And we find it very difficult. Even like now, you just testified in Kenya, you cannot even know where is the money coming from, which these candidates are using. So how do you, according to your own opinion, how can African countries, and also with support from other world countries that have done enough work in terms of ensuring that political parties be transparent in terms of where they get their money from, and also how they disclose, I mean how they account, and also disclose this to the public? How can we support political parties and also candidates themselves to ensure that they are transparent enough in disclosing how much money they have gotten, and also how much money they have spent, and maybe how much money they have retained? How can we support political parties and candidates?
Thank you very much for that question. Yeah, I think it will be difficult to compel, to force political parties to disclose any information if there's no policy or a legal framework that compels them to do that. So what we need, I think, firstly, is a good law, a good legal framework, sound policies that compels political parties to do that. So this can be political parties registration first. Once they are registered, part of registration, I think some of the requirements should be that they avail they avail resources or their accounts to the body that is registering them as a requirement. And then they also sign, it could be a code of conduct, it could be an MOU, whatever. That also requires the regulatory body to audit, to check, to scrutinize the accounts or documents of a political party. So if there's no policy, if there's no law, I think it will be very difficult to do that, in my view. So what we need first and foremost is the law and sound policies. Then coming back to the issue of code of conduct, I think that one is very, very important in terms of putting in place sound policies. I think that's one area where political parties can, even the leadership can be forced to abide, to make public declarations of abiding to such things like the code of conduct or the statutory instrument that are provided for by that particular country, in particular on disclosing. If it's a requirement that before renewal of your registration as a political party, you need to publish your audited accounts, let it be. If it's a requirement that every year a political party should avail its annual report, for example, to the public domain, maybe have it published and put on the website, let it be, because those are the things that we want to also scrutinize in terms of making sure that there is a fair level playing ground in terms of the use of finances, the use of resources and money in elections. So we need to compel them, but there's need for a sound law. I also wanted to comment on the issue of regulatory institutions that Magnus also alluded to. That most of the EMBs they don't want to regulate political parties. I think even for my country, Zimbabwe, our electoral commission has also been saying they want a separate institution to deal with that. It comes with a burden that regulatory and political parties, by virtue, they are trying to get into power. It's not easy. They have their own behind the scenes challenges, intra-party problems, inter-party challenges. So it's also not easy to regulate. So many countries actually opt for a separate registrar and regulatory body to do that. But again, if it's a commission or an EMB that decides or that agrees to undertake that particular role, then there's need for a truly independent EMB, an independent that is credible, that is respected, that people has confidence in and trusts. Because the other challenges, they also be unfair or to the various political parties. So there's need for a truly independent election management board that can undertake that role. If it's a regulatory board that is separate, in the case of Kenya, the Office of the Registrar of Political, it should also be truly independent and should also, in its own fairness, make sure that it compels political parties and enforces all the rules, policies, or laws that are provided for every political party, I think, on a level pledge. So that's one area that we need to continuously lobby for as civic society. We wish, Magnus, we endeavor to get to the level where countries like Finland, you alluded to, are as Africa. But our democracy is still growing, and but as civic society, we continue to push and we continue to want to endeavor to be there where there's transparency, where we can really scrutinize what kind of resources are being used, who is donating these resources, and where the funding is coming from. I'll also give you an example of Liberia. If I recall well, they actually have a law that does not require any political parties to receive money that is more than, I think it's 10,000, if I'm not mistaken, either 10,000, yeah, 10,000 US dollars from one individual. So the law is very clear, and what the EMB does is to make sure that political parties submit annual reports, audited accounts, so they can actually scrutinize if political parties are adhering to that specific law. But one person was also arguing that if I'm a donor, if I'm an individual, I want to donate funding, I can donate 10,000. I give my friend another 10. I give my wife another 10, my daughter, my son, and we are different individuals funding a party, and we can fund maybe 500,000, but giving different people to do it. So still there's need to continuously strengthen, to need to continuously have those checks and balances, even in the policies and the laws that we have in the different countries with regards to political parties financing, and also trying to make sure that the use of ICTs is an emerging tool that we can use either to monitor, to scrutinize, and even to gather information, data about how political parties' finances are being used in politics and elections. I've asked the moderator if I can be excused. Thank you very much. It was very exciting. I think that will be my parting shot as well. I hope to join you again in the near future in other debates. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. Ellen Dingane, for joining us and for sharing your thoughts. We appreciate your efforts and we wish you all the best in the observation in Kenya. So I want to come back to Dr. Magnus. You just had Helen sharing some of her insights on some of the things that need to be done in order to strengthen the political parties and also the candidates, so that they can be willing to declare their sources of campaigns and how much they have spent. In your own thought as an expert in this area, do you think it's very possible to have political parties and also candidates have the willingness to disclose how much money they have gotten, how much money they have spent in Africa?
Yes, I do, though not tomorrow. This is a longer term process. This is work that needs to be ongoing. And I agree completely with everything that Ellen said. And then I want to add the other side, which is what she does excellently on a day-to-day basis, which is the civil society aspect. And it's important that we don't lose track of that. To be honest, I don't think there is any African country where we can conceivably force political parties to be transparent through introducing a new law tomorrow and having an oversight body that will enforce this and that will sanction and punish parties that are not transparent. I'm not even sure I would advocate that we try. I think there's a significant risk that in trying to create transparency in democracy, we lose democracy, right? This is parties and election campaigns are essential to do the democratic process. And we must remember that. And we must remember that across African countries, we have many examples of governments trying to enforce things, but ending up losing democracy in the process. So what I want to stress is the demand side. Citizens saying, if you want to run my country, I want to know where you got your money. I want to know where those 7 helicopters, how they were paid for example. So the issue of citizens saying, we actually want to know this. We are not going to vote for you unless you tell us how that money came from. So that, I think, is an essential part of this process. We cannot only look at governments and institutions and laws, but also pressure from below, which can help change the behavior of political parties and politicians, and also help changing legislation down the line. But this needs to be demand driven and it's very long term. And part of this is also, you know what, I think many political parties in Africa, if we ask them, can you tell us how much you spent in the election campaigns? Can you give us the invoices? Their honest answer, if they wanted to be honest, is no, we don't know. Because the bookkeeping within political parties tends to be really bad in most African countries. If you talk to a party treasurer, he might know or she might know how much the party headquarters have spent on various things, but has no clue of what's been happening on the ground. And a lot of campaigning in many African countries is very decentralized. So another key to this is parties must also be given the assistance and to take seriously the role of actually tracking themselves how much money that they raise and spend. A lot of African parties lose a lot of money through internal corruption. So that's another issue we need to address.
Thank you so much, Dr. Omar. I want to come back to Emma. There was a question that I saw Eddie Kainda had asked about how some of the African countries, for example, governments in Africa deliberately switch off social media, which is one of the ICT tool which we use sometimes during elections. But there is just a general feeling that most governments in Africa don't fancy the usage of ICT, especially when they know that it's likely to expose them. So they tend to either switch it off or do away with it. So I want to know from you, how can we change that mindset and narrative among some of these government leaders so that they can know that one way of being transparent and also being seen as people who are responsible and want to lead their citizens in a manner that is open and transparent is by allowing such things to flourish, and so that people can get to know, okay, what are they doing here? Are they getting money from maybe outside foreigners or what? Or are they getting money from the government's resource envelope? So how can we change that narrative and perception among its government leaders and also regimes in power who have the tendency of switching off or sabotaging the ICT tools during election periods?
Thank you very much, moderator. That's a very interesting question. Yeah, the last elections we had social media, not just social media. It was the whole internet infrastructure that was actually switched off. It wasn't just social media. You couldn't do any bank transactions. You couldn't access emails. You couldn't do anything. So it's become a culture in several other African countries. But I think in Nigeria, they had Twitter switched off, I think, during elections. It was Twitter because Twitter is one of the most used in Nigeria. For Uganda, it's been Facebook up to today. It's still officially locked out. You can only access it via VPN up to today. So I think the idea of switching off internet is just the fear of governments exposing whatever is going on during election days. Scenarios where maybe people start to share DR forms on election day, and maybe somebody has a smart tool that is able to aggregate all this data and is trying to give maybe election results. But we all know that in most countries, the mandate of declaring results and aggregating results is purely that of the EMB, the election management body. But of course, individual political parties will have interests. Independent candidates will have interest in trying to see that can I be able to verify my results before even the Electoral Commission declares them. Of course, to be honest with you, I think the only way we're going to have to achieve this is either through legislation and maybe a code of conduct that once a government is coming in power, they probably will not interfere with the fourth estate. Because basically, shutting down internet is basically not recognizing the role played by media in every democracy. And I want to believe that every democracy across the world must be able to respect the role that media plays, because it shares information and brings all this information to the platform. I mean, I think Dr. Oman would definitely agree that in developed nations like his and the US, whatever criticism you receive from the people, it doesn't give you the guarantee to shut down internet. But most of African governments and democracies are young and they're growing. And I think it is definitely something that is achievable tomorrow. I wouldn't say it's achievable definitely in a couple of years, but not immediately tomorrow. I wouldn't be surprised in 2026, we still go through the similar scenario where internet is switched off. Kenya has not yet done it, but it's happened in Uganda and a couple of other democracies where internet is switched off. I think it is also the same thing that happens in Ethiopia and several other African countries. So it's not news, it happens. And it is a question of continuously civil society building a movement that continues to encourage the government to understand the role that is played by social media and to allow themselves to be open to criticisms to improve democracy through all these transparent methods. Because a credible election is only very credible when you allow transparency to be part and parcel of the whole package. So I think it requires a lot of engagement with governments, and it is not something that you're going to achieve in one day. It's going to take continuous engagement. It is going to take legislation. It's going to take sharing with other countries their experiences, but also just still on this issue of data and the legal framework. Maybe it's something we can start push through the regional bodies like the East African Commission or any of these regional bodies, that if you want to be part and part of the EAC, maybe we should start thinking about legislation at that level, that every country is required to ensure that even during a campaign, you shouldn't be able to switch off internet as a requirement from the East African body, so that we are accountable to each of the regional blocks in that perspective. So we have to think outside the box and come up with solutions and ideas that we'll be able to use to actually address this phenomenon. Yeah, thank you. And of course, just before I go off, I know some governments have signed up to this thing called the Open Government Partnership, OGP, which has components around opening up and disclosure of information and data that maybe can still be adopted even within issues to do with elections, campaign finance, and so forth. So that if you're signing up as a country, as a member of the Open Government Partnership, OGP, then you should be required to adhere to some of these instruments. So it becomes a sort of global instrument, just like the way Uganda is a signatory to several other international statutes, that is part and parcel of how a democracy should be run. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Emmanuel. Dr. Magnus, you've just heard from Emmanuel sharing how our African countries can try to respect and ensure that the fourth estate, which encompasses ICT, can be respected and they don't switch off internet during election periods. And we have seen, for example, in Uganda here, in the last general election, they switched off internet on claims that it's a security measure. So according to you, as one of as an expert in the area of electoral democracy, is it really necessary for a government to switch off internet at a critical time where citizens want to access information, data, and all of those other things during an election time in the name of a security measure?
Well, there would have to be very extreme reasons for switching off communication tools between citizens. And in most scenarios and most situations where this has happened, I would argue that those conditions have not been met. And I think, like Emmanuel was saying, there are situations we can consider legislation, we can consider codes of conduct. There is another way. What if a situation where a government turns off the internet before an election, and the people's response is, okay, so we're not going to vote for you. And they completely vote that party out of power. Again, that's not something that's going to happen tomorrow. There are a lot of conditions and situations. There is clientelism, there are relationships. But if we have that response, then down the line, governments will say, well, we're probably not going to do that because that's not in our interest. And if we look also in more general terms about the issue of transparency in money in politics we're talking about, if we're looking at countries in contexts where it works a bit better, because it doesn't work well anywhere. There's no country on the planet that doesn't have problems with money in politics. But where it works a bit better, it's normally not because there are strict laws. It's normally not because there is really strict enforcement and control. It's normally because politicians know that if I, for example, let's say I raise pensions shortly before an election, that doesn't actually help me because the voters don't like it. They will say, well, you are just abusing my taxpayers' money and giving it back to me. You are bribing me with my own money. And where voters don't respond to such practices, then they will stop, because no politician wants to use the 7 helicopters or spend the large amounts of money. They do it because they think they can win power that way. And they're right in many cases. But if we make them wrong, if we push from below to say this is not acceptable behavior in our society, then those activities will change. Long-term goal, but it does work.
Our moderator's gone off. That's interesting. But
we don't have a moderator, so we can say whatever we want.
So we can just have a chat. That's interesting. But I want to agree with you, but it's definitely a long shot where citizens decide to say that we are not voting. But you see, I think the critical component and aspect for me, which I think basically in most African countries, is that what is the reason for voting? Because you see, if the reason for voting is based on issues and transparency and all these things, then it makes sense. But we've witnessed many times the reasons people vote here is because they're probably giving them some money, they are bribing them to vote, they're bribing people to come to political rallies, they're bribing people to do all these kind of things. And this is money you cannot, in a way, be able to have credible data sources to actually allude to in campaign financing. I mean, at the end of the day, some of these things are done behind closed doors. You may take a video and share it on social media and say, hey guys, so-and-so has been bribing people here and there. But that's it. You cannot tell how much money has actually been spent in that occasion and how much has been spent bribing all the different citizens across the country, because it's practically not part and parcel of the technology framework. This is a manual process. But maybe continuously, as African countries adopt digital transactions of money, then we will start to see a difference. Because if most of our transactions are done manually, I come with a bag full of money to buy anything or a car, then it continuously becomes difficult. But probably as we continue to push African economies to adopt digital technologies in terms of payments and maybe bank transfers, point of sale points where you can just swap your ATMs for any purchases that you're doing, the use of mobile money, of course, which has now become a big thing in Africa. So maybe then we can start to be able to actually speak to how much money is being spent in all these processes. But as long as we continue to use hard cash currency in the campaigns, it's really difficult. But as we continue to push for adopting of practices, it's not even legislation. It's pushing an economy to adopt practices that include using digital transfer of money, because then you're also able to cut down on corruption and all this illicit financing that happens. You then have a sort of a database to look at the flow of money, where it's coming from. Because even when you look at things like crowdfunding, whichever technology platform that you use, it's not really highly used in most of the African countries, even by political parties, to actually raise money. I think the last campaign I saw, either one of the opposition political parties share phone numbers to receive cash from people who are interested, but you can't tell how much money they are receiving throughout the day. You cannot speak to it. You just know, okay, yes, there is a phone number they're using to receive money, but you cannot actually tell how much they have done that. Of course, you need a court order for you to know the transactions that have gone on that particular phone number. And it's not public knowledge. And neither will the political party be willing to say, yes, through this framework of this phone number that we share, this is the amount of money that we have done received. So I think it's still work in progress. There are several strategies that can be adopted, but I think we're still at the initial stages, and there are definitely tools and strategies on how best that can be done. Abel, welcome back. You had left us alone.
No, I had some connectivity challenges, so I had to maneuver and come back. So thanks for waiting. There was a question Felix asked. I don't know whether it was responded to. It was from Felix. But I don't know whether I can flash it back so that Dr. Magnus can respond to it. That beyond regulation and can be put in place to encourage transparency in political party funding?
Yeah, I would simply go to what we have been discussing a lot, which is pressure from below. And I think that's especially important in African societies. This discussion we're having right now is part of that process of pushing for reform. And again, I think legal reform, formal oversight, the involvement of the police and courts, all of that is incredibly important. And I spend a lot of my time working on those things. But I really also want to stress, and I can't stress that enough, the role of media and the role of civil society. Emmanuel makes an incredibly important point just now about why people vote. And I think that if we don't address that, then we can't really get to the problem of why it's important how money is raised and spent. But if we are engaging citizens in a dialogue of what does democracy mean for us in a society, in wherever we are in Africa or anywhere else, what is the long-term impact of that? What is the importance, not just for us, but for our children and our grandchildren, long-term development of our societies? To gradually change the thing that if I receive some money today and I vote in a certain way, that gives me a benefit today. But it hurts my country and my children, my grandchildren, down decades down the line. So the role of civil society there is incredibly important. The organization I work for, IFES, the International Foundation for Electoral System, is in the process of delivering a guide, of publishing a guide on the civil society experience of monitoring campaign finance. And that draws on the experience from groups across the world, including countries like Nigeria, Kenya, Uganda, Ghana, and of course, ZESEN that we just heard from in Zimbabwe, from Ellen. But that handbook deals with a lot of these issues, a lot of these complications, and the use of ICT by civil society as well, which is another issue we mustn't forget.
Thank you. We have come really to the tail end of this webinar series, so I would like each of us to give their concluding remarks, and we end today's webinar series. I will start with you, Emmanuel.
Yeah, thank you very much, Abel and ACFIM, for inviting me to be part of this very important discussion on the role of ICT in enhancing electoral financing. I think definitely technology is a growing trend across the world, not just in Africa. And many technology tools will keep coming, and just to enhance issues to do with transparency and so forth. I mean, yes, you mentioned things like Bitcoins and all these other frameworks and all the emerging technologies that are coming through, the importance of artificial intelligence in as far as democracy is concerned. I think each of these are definitely areas that are very important to citizens. And like I've mentioned, and the way Dr. Magnus has also emphasized, it's very imperative that the citizens know why they are voting. So as civil society and as part and parcel of the civil society framework, it is very important that the civic duty to encourage citizens to know the reason they vote and why they vote and why they have to hold their leaders accountable is something that is very critical. That even when campaigns are going on and when people are promising to take leadership of a country, there has to be a social contract that when you become my president, when you become my member of parliament, when you become my LC1 chairperson in my village, these are my expectations. This is the standard of behavior and integrity that I expect of you as a leader. This sort of accountability, even with the resources that you're using for campaigns, are issues that are important to me. So if citizens can get to understand that, then I think it becomes easier for technology to now play the role it is supposed to play, because the data sets and the information will be there, and that information will be able to enhance transparency and combat issues of using a lot of these monies within political finance that we cannot assess where it's coming from. And eventually you notice that every time we finish an election in Uganda, we actually have an inflation. You know, the cost of living goes way too high and so forth. It takes almost 2 years before an economy recovers from that, then again in 2-3 years, you're back to the same trajectory and the same sort of trend. Yeah, thank you very much. And I look forward to the next discussion. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Emmanuel. Lastly, we go to Dr. Magnus Hoffman.
Well, thank you, Abel. And I think Emmanuel has emphasized the key points. The main thing is to build this pressure and this demand and the social contract between those who lead our country or our locality and the people. And ICT has a potentially important role in building this transparency. But we need to look at small steps. We need to look at what can be done gradually, what needs to happen in which order. Forget ICT doesn't have any role on its own. It's a tool for us to use in building transparency. And that's something that we need to then use as a gradual enforcement. And we need to gradually at each step also evaluate how this process works. Look out for unintended consequences because they will happen, but slowly we can build a long-term increase in transparency. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hoffman and Emmanuel, and also Ellen who left us. It has been awesome having all of you discussing this interesting topic. I want to also thank those who have been following us from wherever you have been. This webinar series runs every last Thursday of every month. At the end of every last Thursday of every month, we always have Money in Politics webinar series, which is brought to you by Alliance Finance Monitoring Acting, which is a political finance watchdog in Africa. My name is Abel Esero, and I've been stepping in for Mr. Felix Kafuma, who is the moderator of this webinar series. I want to thank all those who have been following us and also appreciate all the panelists who have been with us today. Thank you so much, and God bless you all.
Thank you.
One of the major challenges related to money in politics is the lack of transparency surrounding political party and election finance. Open and transparent funding of political parties and candidates is desirable because it helps to ensure everyone is playing by the rules. This in turn strengthens the integrity of and trust in politics of the general public and political parties in Africa. Transparency helps to level the playing field, exposes the risk of undue influence over politicians, and helps protect against the infiltration of illicit sources of money, thus contributing to the broader fight against corruption. In recent years, there has been considerable progress in the use of information technology to enhance transparency in financing political parties and election campaigns. The rapid digitalization of government agencies, political parties, and citizens alike has significantly expanded the potential to use digital tools to enhance transparency. Use of technology, including digital tools such as websites, programs, and online resources, can help provide solutions towards addressing undeclared, undisclosed, and/or dirty money in politics. When a country builds an online reporting and disclosure system, it becomes part of a wider societal effort to protect and enhance the integrity of politics. In this 8th webinar series on money in politics in Africa, we interrogate the role of ICT in political finance reporting and disclosure.